The Dark Enlightenment Part 4, Rerunning the Race to Ruin. Nick Land. Liberals are baffled and infuriated that poor whites vote Republican, yet voting on tribal grounds is a feature of all multi-ethnic democracies, whether in Northern Ireland, Lebanon or Iraq. The more a majority becomes a minority, the more tribal its voting becomes, so that increasingly the Republicans have become the white party. Making this point indelicately got Pat Buchanan the sack, but many others make it too. Will it happen here, in the UK? The patterns are not dissimilar. In the 2010 election, the Conservatives won only 16% of the ethnic minority vote, while Labour won the support of 72% of Bangladeshis, 78% of African Caribbeans and 87% of Africans. The Tories are slightly stronger among British Hindus and Sikhs, mirroring Republican support among Asian Americans, who are more likely to be home-owning professionals and feel less alienated. The Economist recently asked if the Tories had a race problem, but it may just be that democracy has a race problem. Ed West, here. Without a taste for irony, Mencius Moldbug is all but unendurable, and certainly unintelligible. Vast structures of historical irony shape his writings, at times even engulfing them. How otherwise could a proponent of traditional configurations of social order, a self-proclaimed Jacobite, compose a body of work that is stubbornly dedicated to subversion? Irony is Moldbug's method, as well as his milieu. This can be seen, most tellingly, in his chosen name for the usurped Enlightenment, the dominant faith of the modern world, universalism. This is a word that he appropriates and capitalizes within a reactionary diagnosis whose entire force lies in its exposure of an exorbitant particularity. Moldbug turns continually to history, or, more rigorously, cladistics, to accurately specify that which asserts its own universal significance whilst ascending to a state of general dominance that approaches the universal. Under this examination, what counts as universal reason, determining the direction and meaning of modernity, is revealed as the minutely determined branch or subspecies of a cultic tradition, descended from ranters, levelers, and closely related variants of dissident, ultra-Protestant fanaticism, and owing vanishingly little to the conclusions of logicians. Ironically, then, the world's regnant universalist democratic egalitarian faith is a particular or peculiar cult that has broken out, along identifiable historical and geographical pathways, with an epidemic virulence that is disguised as progressive global enlightenment. The route that it has taken, through England and New England, Reformation, and Revolution, is recorded by an accumulation of traits that provide abundant material for irony, and for lower varieties of comedy. The unmasking of the modern liberal intellectual or open-minded media truth-teller as a pale, fervent, narrowly doctrinaire Puritan, recognizably descended from the species of witch-burning zealots, is reliably and irresistibly entertaining. Yet, as the cathedral extends and tightens its grip upon everything, everywhere, in accordance with its divine mandate, the response it triggers is only atypically humorous. More commonly, when unable to exact humble compliance, it encounters inarticulate rage, or at least uncomprehending, smoldering resentment, as befits the imposition of parochial cultural dogmas, still wrapped in the trappings of a specific, alien pedigree, even as they earnestly confess to universal rationality. Consider, for instance, the most famous words of America's Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Could it be honestly maintained that to submit, scrupulously and sincerely, to such self-evident truths amounts to anything other than an act of religious reconfirmation or conversion? Or deny that, in these words, reason and evidence are explicitly set aside, to make room for principles of faith? Could anything be less scientific than such a declaration, or more indifferent to the criteria of genuinely universal reasoning? How could anybody who was not already a believer be expected to consent to such assumptions? That the founding statement of the Democratic Republican Creed should be formulated as a statement of pure, and doctrinally recognizable, faith is information of sorts, but it is not yet irony. The irony begins with the fact that among the elites of today's cathedral, these words of the Declaration of Independence, as well as many others, would be found, almost universally, to be quaintly suggestive at best, perhaps vaguely embarrassing, and most certainly incapable of supporting literal assent. Even amongst libertarian-slanted conservatives, a firm commitment to natural rights is unlikely to proceed confidently and emphatically to their divine origination. For modern liberals, believers in the rights-bestowing, or entitlement state, such archaic ideas are not only absurdly dated, but positively obstructive. For that reason, they are associated less with revered predecessors than with the retarded, fundamentalist thinking of political enemies. Sophisticates of the cathedral core understand, as Hegel did, that God is no more than deep government apprehended by infants, and is such a waste of faith, that bureaucrats could put to better use. Since the cathedral has ascended to global supremacy, It no longer has need for founding fathers, who awkwardly recall its parochial ancestry, and impede its transnational public relations. Rather, it seeks perpetual reinvigoration through their denigration. The phenomenon of the new atheism, with its transparent progressive affiliations, attests abundantly to this. Paleo-Puritanism must be derided in order for Neo-Puritanism to flourish. The meme is dead, long live the meme. At the limit of self-parody, Neo-Puritan parricide takes the form of the ludicrous War on Christmas, in which the allies of the cathedral sanctify the radically unthreatened separation of church and state through nuisance agitation against public expressions of traditional Christian piety, and their red state dupes respond with dyspeptic outrage on cable TV shows. Like every other war against fuzzy nouns, whether poverty, drugs, or terror, the outcome is predictably perverse. If resistance to the war on Christmas is not yet established as the solid center of Yuletide festivities, it can be confidently expected to become so in the future. The purposes of the cathedral are served nonetheless, through promotion of a synthetic secularism that separates the progressive faith from its religious foundations, whilst directing attention away from the ethnically specific, dogmatic creedal content at its core. As reactionaries go, traditional Christians are generally considered to be quite cuddly. Even the most wild-eyed fanatics of the Neo-Puritan orthodoxy have trouble getting genuinely excited about them, although abortion activists get close. For some real red meat, with the nerves exposed and writhing to jolts of hard stimulation, it makes far more sense to turn to another discarded and ceremonially abominated block on the progressive lineage, white identity politics, or, the term Moldbug opts for, white nationalism. Just as the ratchet progress of Neo-Puritan social democracy is radically facilitated by the orchestrated pillorying of its embryonic religious forms, so is its trend to consistently neo-fascist political economy smoothed by the concerted repudiation of a neo-Nazi, or paleo-fascist, threat. It is extremely convenient, when constructing ever more nakedly corporatist or third-position structures of state-directed pseudo-capitalism, to be able to divert attention to angry expressions of white racial paranoia, especially when these are ornamented by clumsily modified Nazi insignia, horned helmets, Leni Riefenstahl aesthetics, and slogans borrowed freely from Mein Kampf. In the United States, and thus, with shrinking time lag, internationally, the icons of the Ku Klux Klan, from white bedsheets, quasi-Masonic titles, and burning crosses, to lynching ropes, have acquired comparable theatrical value. Moldbug offers a sanitized white nationalist blog reading list, consisting of writers who, to varying degrees of success, avoid immediate reversion to paleo-fascist self-parody. The first step beyond the boundary of respectable opinion is represented by Lawrence Auster, a Christian, anti-Darwinist, and traditionalist conservative who defends substantial, ethno-racial, national identity and opposes the liberal master principle of non-discrimination. By the time we reach Tanchtafel, at the ripped outer edge of Moldbug's carefully truncated spectrum, we have entered a decaying orbit, spiraling into the great black hole that is hidden at the dead center of modern political possibility. Before following the Tanchtafel into the crushing abyss where light dies, there are some preliminary remarks to make about the white nationalist perspective and its implications. Even more than the Christian traditionalists, who, even in their cultural midwinter, can bask in the warmth of supernatural endorsement, white identity politics considers itself besieged. Moderate or measured concern offers no equilibrium for those who cross the line and begin to self-identify in these terms. Instead, the path of involvement demands rapid acceleration to a state of extreme alarm, or racial panic, conforming to an analysis focused upon malicious population replacement at the hands of a government which, in the oft-cited words of Bertolt Brecht, has decided to dissolve the people and to appoint another one. Whiteness, whether conceived biologically, mystically, or both, is associated with vulnerability, fragility, and persecution. This theme is so basic, and so multifarious, that it is difficult to adequately address succinctly. It encompasses everything from criminal predation, especially racially charged murders, rapes and beatings, economic exactions and inverse discrimination, cultural aggression by hostile academic and media systems, and ultimately genocide or definitive racial destruction. Typically, the prospective annihilation of the white race is attributed to its own systematic vulnerability, whether due to characteristic cultural traits, excessive altruism, susceptibility to moral manipulation, excessive hospitality, trust, universal reciprocity, guilt, or individualistic disdain for group identity, or more immediate biological factors, recessive genes supporting fragile Aryan phenotypes. Whilst it is unlikely that this sense of unique endangerment is reducible to the chromatic formula white plus color equals color, the fundamental structure is of this kind. In its abstract depiction of non-reciprocal vulnerability, it reflects the one-drop rule and Mendelian recessive, dominant gene combination. It depicts mixture as essentially anti-white. Because whiteness is a limit, pure absence of color, it slips smoothly from the biological factuality of the Caucasian subspecies into metaphysical and mystical ideas. Rather than accumulating genetic variation, a white race is contaminated or polluted by admixtures that compromise its defining negativity. To darken it is to destroy it. The mythological density of these, predominantly subliminal, associations invests white identity politics with a resilience that frustrates enlightened efforts at rationalistic denunciation, whilst contradicting its own paranoid self-representation. It also undermines recent white nationalist promotions of a racial threat that is strictly comparable to that facing indigenous peoples, universally, and depicting whites as natives cruelly deprived of equal protection against extinction. There is no route back to tribal innocence, or flat, biological diversity. Whiteness has been compacted indissolubly with ideology, whichever the road taken. If blacks can have it, and Hispanics can have it, and Jews can have it, why can't we have it? That's the final building block of white nationalist grievance, the werewolf curse that means it can only ever be a monster. There's exactly one way out for persecuted palefaces, and it leads straight into a black hole. We promised to get back to Tanstoffel, and here we are, in late summer 2007, shortly after he got the Jew thing. There isn't anything very original about his epiphany, which is exactly the point. He quotes himself. Isn't it absurd that anyone would even think to blame Christianity or WASPs for the rise of PC and its catastrophic consequences? Isn't this in fact a reversal of the truth? Hasn't the rise and spread of PC eroded the power of Christianity, WASPs, and whites in general? Blaming them is in effect blaming the victim. Yes, there are Christians, WASPs, and whites who have fallen for the PC brainwashing. Yes, there are some who have taken it so deeply to heart that they work to expand and protect it. That's the nature of PC. That is its purpose. To control the minds of the people it seeks to destroy. The left, at its root, is all about destruction. You don't have to be an anti-Semite to notice where these ideas originate from and who benefits. But you do have to violate PC to say Jews. That's the labyrinth, the trap, with its pitifully constricted, stereotypical circuit. Why can't we be cuddly racial preservationists, like Amazonian Indians? How come we always turn into neo-Nazis? It's some kind of conspiracy, which means it has to be the Jews. Since the mid-20th century, the political intensity of the globalized world has streamed, almost exclusively, out of the cratered ash pile of the Third Reich. Until you get the pattern, it seems mysterious that there's no getting away from it. After listing some blogs falling under the relatively genteel category of white nationalism, Moldbug cautions. The internet is also home to many out-and-out racist blogs. Most are simply unreadable. But some are hosted by relatively capable writers. On these racist blogs you'll find racial epithets, anti-Semitism, see why I'm not an anti-Semite, and the like. Obviously, I cannot recommend any of these blogs, and nor will I link to them. However, if you are interested in the mind of the modern racist, Google will get you there. Google is overkill. A little link trawling will get you there. It's a 6 degrees of separation problem, and more like 2 or less. Start digging into the actually existing reactosphere, and things get quite astoundingly ugly very quickly. Yes, there really is hate, panic, and disgust, as well as a morbidly addictive abundance of very grim, vitriolic wit, and a disconcertingly impressive weight of credible fact. These guys just love statistics to death. Most of all, just beyond the horizon, there's the black hole. If reaction ever became a popular movement, its few slender threads of bourgeois, or perhaps dreamily aristocratic, civility wouldn't hold back the beast for long. As liberal decency has severed itself from intellectual integrity, and exiled harsh truths, these truths have found new allies, and become considerably harsher. The outcome is mechanically, and monotonously, predictable. Every liberal democratic cause strengthens and feralizes what it fights. The war on poverty creates a chronically dysfunctional underclass. The war on drugs creates crystallized superdrugs and mega-mafias. Guess what? The war on political incorrectness creates data-empowered, web-coordinated, paranoid and polyconspiratorial werewolves, superbly positioned to take advantage of liberal democracy's impending rendezvous with ruinous reality, and to then play their part in the unleashing of unpleasantnesses that are scarcely imaginable, except by disturbing historical analogy. When a sane, pragmatic, and fact-based negotiation of human differences is forbidden by ideological fiat, the alternative is not a reign of perpetual peace, but a festering of increasingly self-conscious and militantly defiant thought crime, nourished by publicly unavowable realities, and energized by powerful, atavistic, and palpably dissident mythologies. That's obvious, on the net. Moldbug considers the danger of white nationalism to be both over and understated. On the one hand, the menace is simply ridiculous, and merely reflects Neo-Puritan spiritual dogma in its most hysterically oppressive and stubbornly mindless form. It should be obvious that, although I am not a white nationalist, I am not exactly allergic to the stuff, Moldbug remarks, before describing it as the most marginalized and socially excluded belief system in the history of the world, an obnoxious social irritant in any circle which does not include tattooed speed freak bikers. Yet the danger remains, or rather, is under construction. I can imagine one possibility which might make white nationalism genuinely dangerous. White nationalism would be dangerous if there was some issue on which white nationalists were right and everyone else was wrong. Truth is always dangerous. Contrary to common belief, it does not always prevail. But it's always a bad idea to turn your back on it. While the evidence for human cognitive biodiversity is indeed debatable, what's not debatable is that it is debatable, even though everyone who is not a white nationalist has spent the last 50 years informing us that it is not debatable. There's far more to Moldbug's essay, as there always is. Eventually it explains why he rejects white nationalism, on grounds that owe nothing to conventional reflexes. But the dark heart of the essay, lifting it beyond brilliance to the brink of genius, is found early on, at the edge of a black hole. Why does white nationalism strike us as evil? Because Hitler was a white nationalist, and Hitler was evil. Neither of these statements is remotely controvertible. There is exactly one degree of separation between white nationalism and evil. And that degree is Hitler. Let me repeat, Hitler. The argument seems watertight. Hitler tight? But it holds no water at all. Why does socialism strike us as evil? Because Stalin was a socialist, and Stalin was evil. Anyone who wants to seriously argue that Stalin was less evil than Hitler has an awful long road to hoe. Not only did Stalin order more murders, his murder machine had its heyday in peacetime, whereas Hitler's can at least be seen as a war crime against enemy civilians. Whether this makes a difference can be debated, but if it does, it puts Stalin on top. And yet I have never had or seen anything like the red flag's response to socialism, the sense of the presence of evil. If I saw a crowd of young, fashionable people lining up at the box office for a hagiographic biopic on Reinhard Heydrich, chills would run up and down my neck. For Ernesto Guevara, I have no emotional response. Perhaps I think it's stupid and sad. I do think it's stupid and sad. But it doesn't freak me out. Any attempt to be nuanced, balanced, or proportional in the moral case against Hitler is to entirely misconstrue the nature of the phenomenon. This can be noted, quite regularly, in Asian societies, for instance, because the ghost of the Third Reich does not occupy central position in their history, or rather, their religion, although, as the inner sanctum of the cathedral, it is determined to, and shows almost every sign of succeeding. A brief digression on cross-cultural misunderstanding and reciprocal blindness might be merited at this point. When Westerners pay attention to the God-Emperor style of political devotion that has accompanied modern totalitarianism in East Asia, the conclusion typically drawn is that this pattern of political feeling is exotically alien, morbidly amusing, and ultimately chillingly incomprehensible. Contemporary comparisons with laughably non-numinous Western democratic leaders only deepen the confusion, as do clumsy quasi-Marxist references to feudal sensibilities, as if absolute monarchy was not an alternative to feudalism, and as if absolute monarchs were worshipped. How could a historical and political figure ever be invested with the transcendent dignity of absolute religious meaning? It seems absurd. Look, I'm not saying that Hitler was a particularly nice guy. To imagine such words is already to see many things. It might even provoke the question, does anybody within the cathedral's, globalized world still think that Adolf Hitler was less evil than the Prince of Darkness himself? Perhaps only a few scattered paleo-Christians, who stubbornly insist that Satan is really, really bad, and an even smaller number of neo-Nazi ultras, who think Hitler was kind of cool. For pretty much everybody else, Hitler perfectly personifies demonic monstrosity, transcending history and politics to attain the stature of a metaphysical absolute, evil incarnate. Beyond Hitler it is impossible to go, or think. This is surely interesting, since it indicates an eruption of the infinite within history, a religious revelation of inverted, yet structurally familiar, Abrahamic type. Holocaust theology already implies as much. In this regard, rather than Satan, it might be more helpful to compare Hitler to the Antichrist, which is to say, to a mirror Messiah, of reversed moral polarity. There was even an empty tomb. Hitlerism, neutrally conceived, therefore, is less a pro-Nazi ideology than a universal faith, speciated within the Abrahamic superfamily, and united in acknowledging the coming of pure evil on earth. Whilst not exactly worshipped, outside the extraordinarily disreputable circles already ventured into, Hitler is sacramentally abhorred, in a way that touches upon theological first things. If to embrace Hitler as God is a sign of highly lamentable politico-spiritual confusion, at best, to recognize his historical singularity and sacred meaning is near mandatory, since he is affirmed by all men of sound faith as the exact complement of the incarnate God, the revealed anti-Messiah, or adversary, and this identification has the force of self-evident truth. Did anybody ever need to ask why the reductio ad Hitlerum works? Conveniently, like the secularized neo-Puritanism that it swallows, aversive, Hitlerism can be safely taught in American schools, at a remarkably high level of religious intensity. Insofar as progressive or programmatic history continues, this suggests that the Church of Sacred Hitlerite Abomination will eventually supplant its Abrahamic predecessors, to become the world's triumphant ecumenical faith. How could it not? After all, unlike vanilla deism, this is a faith that fully reconciles religious enthusiasm with enlightened opinion, equally adapted, with consummate amphibious capability, to the convulsive ecstasies of popular ritual and the letter pages of the New York Times. Absolute evil once walked amongst us, and lives still. How is this not, already, the principal religious message of our time? All that remains unfinished is the mythological consolidation, and that has long been underway. There's still some bone fragment picking to do among the ashes and debris, in Part 5, before turning to healthier things.